Hi everyone. I'm Sam Moulton. I'm the Director of Educational Research for HILT, and on behalf of Aaron Driver-Lynn and HILT and Harvard, I'd like to welcome you all here today. Rich Mayer is a professor of psychology at UCSB, which looks like this every day of the year, and he for decades has been applying the principles and methods of psychology to the practices and the pedagogies of education. Among his many accomplishments, he received the Thorndike Award for Career Achievement in Educational Psychology and has authored more than 400 chapters and articles in 23 books, including The Promise of Educational Psychology, Multimedia Learning, and E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. It's fair to say that he is the most referenced and influential educational psychologist today. Aaron and I have been trying to get Rich to come here for 3 years, and for 3 reasons. The first reason is that his research is exceptionally good. In the philosophical tradition of strong inference, it begins with a theory-driven set of competing hypotheses, proceeds logically to experimental methods capable of discriminating between these hypotheses, and concludes with a data-driven set of intellectually honest inferences. Second, his research is exceptionally relevant. Rich makes the point that no matter what the proximate educational technology, from chalkboards to discussion boards, learning relies on one ultimate educational technology, the human mind. And there are basic features to our meaty computers, some of which you'll hear about today. These inalienable truths of our mental architecture, when translated to education with incision and integrity, as Rich does, offer a learner-centered, evidence-based approach to many practices of higher education. Finally, his research is not only exceptionally good, and it is not only exceptionally relevant, it's both of these things at the same time. This synergy is as uncommon as it is uncommonly impactful. In the words of William James, we gain confidence in respect to any method which we are using as soon as we believe that it has theory as well as practice at its back. Most of all, it fructifies our independence and it reanimates our interest to see our subject at 2 different angles to get a stereoscopic view. So with you, this stereoscopic audience of practitioners and academics, I hope we can explore some of that synergy today. Note on format, Rich invites timely questions in the middle of his talk, so feel free to shout anything out. I've asked him to reiterate it for the purposes of video recording, and at the conclusion of the talk, we'll open up the floor to any general questions. So please join me in welcoming Rich Mayer.
Oh gosh, thank you for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And I hope you're getting this all on tape. Okay. I'm going to send it back to my dean. Okay. It is really a pleasure to be here at Harvard, and I'm glad I finally did get the chance to come. I really appreciate the hospitality of Sam and Aaron and the HILT Fellows. You've made me feel very much at home here. My talk today is really about applying the science of learning to education. I guess it's appropriate in a way to give this talk here. William James was certainly one of the first to try to do this, and it's kind of summarized in his book, Talks to Teachers, where he tries to summarize what psychology of the late 1800s had to say for teachers, and he kind of concluded, not much yet. I'm hoping, 100 plus years later, that we actually do have something useful to contribute, and certainly education has something useful to contribute to the science of learning. I think it's kind of a mutual relationship. What I like about this field is that it involves both a practical goal and a theoretical goal. And our goal is to improve education, but our goal is also to develop a theory of learning that really applies to real learning in the real world. And I think research questions that have both a theoretical and a practical goal to them are the most exciting and can be the most productive. And I really think this field is at a very exciting point, and I'm glad to see that people are interested in it, and I think we're making tremendous progress, and I'm excited for the future of this field. Um, I would say for the past 20 years or so, I've been focusing on well, really throughout my whole career, I guess, on the issue of how can we help people learn in ways so that they can take what they've learned and apply it to new situations. This is the classic issue of transfer. How can we help people learn so they can transfer what they've learned? And for the past 20 years or so, I guess I've focused on one aspect of instructional design that has potential, I think, for helping people understand, and that involves adding graphics to text. Text is the words, I guess, are the traditional way of communicating ideas to other people, either in this format of speaking or in textbooks or now in computer-based environments. Education is very much based on words. And my question really is, how can we use graphics to enhance the power of words? How can we use words and graphics together to improve understanding of academic content? Does that make sense? Okay. So today I want to share with you the fruits of our research program at UCSB. I never expected to spend this much time studying multimedia learning. I just kind of fell into it, and it kept getting more and more interesting, like I guess most things. So let me begin by pressing this button and hoping something happens. Let's see. Possibly.
Yeah. You pressed the button and nothing happened.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your attention. No, okay. So these are the people who have done all the work, so I'll just skip right over them and get to what I want to talk to you about. I really just want to give you a brief introduction to what I mean by the science of learning and the science of instruction, and spend most of the time on this issue of research-based principles for design of multimedia instruction. We always have to have instructional objectives if you're in the field of education. How many of you are familiar with writing instructional objectives? Okay, so I wrote these, but whatever. We'll just, that's kind of, if I had to write them, that's what I say this talk is about. Let me give you some examples. I get to talk to at medical school sometimes, so I picked these really for medical school, but they would apply to anyone. So here's a graph from a lecture. Let me ask you, what's wrong with this from a pedagogical point of view? Any complaints? See if anybody has any criticisms. Yeah.
Some people with traces are not relevant. How to representation of what is being conveyed.
Yes, so he's saying that, that this graphic of surfing really has nothing to do with the way they're using surfing in this graph. So it's kind of gratuitous, it's extraneous, it's what in the literature people might call seductive detail. It's very nice, it's pretty, but it's distracting, basically. So this is a violation of what I call the coherence principle, which we'll talk about in a minute. Here's a kind of simpler, kind of medical, I guess, graphic from an online source for kids. What would you say is wrong with this as a graphic? Seems nice. It has all the little parts of the body in different colors and nicely numbered. Any complaints about this one or any criticisms? Yeah. Yeah, can't. That's a good point. Just a mechanical problem is you can't really see what the parts of the body are because the color they used is too light. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's crowded, too much information. Go ahead.
I'm doing pretty well with 1, 2, and 3 because they're sort of close to the description is close to the numbers, but after that it starts to, you gotta do some wandering around before you can.
Yeah, that I agree with what everybody is saying. This is a violation of what I call the spatial contiguity principle, which is the idea that words should be placed next to the part of the graphic that they refer to. When you have to have a decoder table, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that corresponds to numbers in the graphic, you know something's wrong. And if your eyes are looking back and forth between the numbers and the parts of the body, that's creating kind of wasted processing, what I call extraneous processing. So this could be designed better, I think. This one is from a PowerPoint it's an online kind of PowerPoint presentation where there's 21 slides that you can go through. And you can't really see this, but my complaint with this one is that it has the caption at the bottom explaining what's going on, and it has a voice that reads that caption to you. So you're listening to the voice saying what's in the caption, you're reading the caption, trying to look at the graphic. That violates what I would call the redundancy principle, because you're having both spoken and printed text. That also creates kind of extraneous processing. And it's probably better to just have the spoken text so that you can use your eyes to look at the graphics. What's wrong with this one? Anybody even know what this is about? Took me a while, yeah. What would you say is wrong with this as a graphic? I mean, this shows everything you'd ever want to know about photosynthesis, I've been told. But, yeah, it has no heading, so we don't really know what it's about. It would be nice to have a heading so they could activate relevant prior knowledge.
I think people have a lot of time learning the language that's written.
Exactly. There's a lot of technical language here, and if you're not already familiar with it, it's overwhelming. So it's just way too complicated. There's just too much information presented. So this could overload people's working memory, given that we know people have a very limited amount of processing capacity. If you're not already experienced and knowledgeable in this area, this would easily overload your working memory. So it violates what I call the segmenting principle, which is the idea that if you have complicated material that you want people to learn, so we can't really drop anything out, the thing to do would be to break it into parts and present it part by part. This is presenting it all at once, and it's overwhelming. This is kind of the opposite of that. It's too simple. Great. It's what I call a representational graphic. Respiratory system, there it is, thank you. So I just wanted to start with those to give you some feeling for the idea that we can probably do a better job using graphics and words to help people understand academic content. And most of my research I focused on science and math content, to be honest, because that's what funding agencies will pay for, but I think it applies to all disciplines. We could talk more about that later, I guess. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on lecturing about what is learning, or what I mean by multimedia learning is quite simple. I just mean using words and pictures to help people learn. Okay, so in multimedia learning, this is learning from words and pictures. And by words, I mean spoken or printed words, and by pictures, I mean both static graphics, things like photos or illustrations or maps, and also dynamic graphics, things like video or animation. Let me just give you a 30-second history of research on learning for those of you who might not be familiar with it. How many people are kind of familiar with research on learning? Oh, okay, a few. So over the course of the probably 100+ year history of the scientific study of learning, I think we've come up with 3 basic metaphors of learning, or kind of conceptualizations of learning. What I call response strengthening, information acquisition, and knowledge construction. The original view, which kind of grew out of mental philosophy, so the mental philosophers already had it all figured out, but we had to start over. Response strengthening is the idea that learning involves strengthening and weakening of associations. So when you're rewarded for doing something, that response gets strengthened. When you're punished, it gets weakened. The obvious instructional method to use would be drill and practice, where, for example, in the 1920s, which is when this idea was in its prominence, the dominant educational practice of the day was called recitation, where a teacher would ask a simple question, call on a student. If they got the right answer, she'd say, that's good. If they got the wrong answer, they'd probably get hit or humiliated. Either get, you could like sit in the corner with a dunce cap on, or maybe just get hit with a ruler or something. So the teacher's job in this case is to dispense rewards and punishments. The student's job or the learner's job is to be kind of a passive recipient and gradually build up the correct associations. This theory is still around in some form or other. Drill and practice is still used a lot for certain kinds of learning, and we know it can be effective. So I'm not really trying to say this is an approach that's no longer around, but it kind of ran its course. It was in prominence from the early 1900s to maybe the 1940s or 50s, and kind of lost ground to the second approach. And so one problem with response strengthening is that it can't really tell us much about meaningful learning or transfer. And I'm interested in transfer, deep learning. This is maybe not the best way to do that. Information acquisition, this developed in the 50s and 60s, kind of at the same time computers were becoming more prevalent. It's kind of a human-computer metaphor. It's the idea that learning involves adding information to memory. Learners are passive recipients of information, kind of sometimes called the empty vessel view, and teachers are the dispensers of information. So just the way computers take in information, store it, and can give it out, that's the way human learning should work or does work. The problem with this approach is that we know that humans interpret information that's coming in and change it into their own personal knowledge. So there's a difference between information and knowledge, and we're really in the knowledge business in education. So it's it's difficult to view learning as some commodity that can be taken from the outside world and placed in someone's head. People always relate it to their prior knowledge, rearrange it, try to make sense out of it. That's how learning works. So information acquisition kind of suggests we should give lectures, kind of what I'm doing, or have textbooks. That's kind of the instructional implication of this approach. Knowledge construction, this is kind of, so information acquisition, like I said, was in the mid-20th century, was dominant. And then towards the middle and end of the 20th century, knowledge acquisition became the more dominant view and still is the dominant view. This is the idea that learning involves building mental representations. The learner's job is to make sense out of what's being presented. The teacher's job is to kind of be a cognitive guide to not only present the information, but also make sure that the learner engages in appropriate cognitive processing of that information. Does that make sense? Okay. So these views are all still around. Their implications are all still valid and still being applied. But I'm going to focus mostly on this third one because it's most relevant to my interest in transfer, I think. The only other thing I want to say here in terms of learning is has to do with active learning, because we're all in favor of active learning. We just don't agree on what that means. For some people, active learning means being physically active, so like hands-on learning. There's a lot of excitement for hands-on learning. But my point I want to make is that it's not physical activity that causes learning. It's cognitive activity that causes learning. So really what we want is people to engage in appropriate cognitive processing, things like paying attention to the relevant material, mentally organizing it into some coherent structure, and relating it to relevant prior knowledge. That's, to me, what I mean by active learning. You can have hands-on learning that results in those processes, and you can have hands-on learning that doesn't. So, and also you can have passive learning situations that do both of those. So I think we want to look at instructional design features that promote processing. So that's my excuse for giving you a lecture. I don't know if you buy it. let me just look at this idea of how learning works. What I tried to do here is look at what we know from cognitive science, take what I think are the main principles, and apply that to a conception of learning that would guide instructional design. So I'm taking three main ideas. The idea of dual channels, which is the idea that humans have separate channels for processing words and pictures. We have separate channels for verbal and visual material. These are processed in different parts of the brain, and there's lots of evidence that these are two separate systems. They interact, but they're separate. Limited capacity, this is the idea that we can only pay attention to a few things at any one time in our consciousness. We can only hold in our active consciousness maybe 4 or 5 pieces of information. And if we give people too much at one time, it will overload their working memory. And third is the idea of active processing. This is the idea that for deep learning to occur, the learner has to engage in certain cognitive processes, the ones I just mentioned, selecting the relevant information, organizing it into a coherent structure, and integrating it with relevant prior knowledge. So you can see the challenge for anybody who's interested in instruction is, how do we prime those cognitive processes without overloading working memory, and also working within a system that has these two different channels? So does that make sense, kind of what I got here? So that's how I kind of developed this little information processing model. You know, in cognitive science, you have to have a flowchart representation, and this is mine. Okay. It starts with the actual presentation, so the multimedia message, we'll say, that consists of words and pictures. It impinges on our eyes and ears. I haven't really looked at other senses. Certainly other senses are relevant, but hearing and seeing are our two major senses, so these are the ones I have been focusing on for academic learning. In sensory memory, the information fades away within a fraction of a second, so we have to pay attention to it in order to bring it into working memory. So those arrows from sensory memory to working memory indicate the cognitive process of selecting. Within working memory, we have to organize the incoming information into what I'm calling a verbal model and a pictorial model. We're trying to make sense out of the images, trying to make sense out of the sounds, build some kind of coherent representation. That's what I mean by those arrows called organizing. Also, we activate relevant prior knowledge from long-term memory, bring it into working memory, and integrate it with the incoming information. And we also integrate the verbal and pictorial material with each other. So that integrating arrow involves, really to me, the essence of understanding. When you do that, it means you understand the material, when you relate it to prior knowledge and when you can see the connection between the words and the pictures. Does that like 2-second explanation make sense? Why did I need a whole chapter to do that? I don't know. Okay, so again, these are the major cognitive processes, I think, in learning, what I'm calling selecting, organizing, and integrating. This is what we're trying to prime with all the instructional devices that I want to talk about. For instruction, all I mean by multimedia instruction is instruction that uses words and pictures. Probably the first attempt that we're aware of to do this in an educational setting is Comenius's book called Orbis Pictus. Has anybody seen this book? Oh good, I can just make it up. It was published in the 1600s, and Comenius's idea was to show children the entire world in pictures. That's what the title really means, the world in pictures. So he has scenes of every possible thing you can think of. Like there's one of a barber shop, and it shows you all the elements in a barber shop. Each one's labeled, and then on the page, in both Latin and in whatever language is the native language of the reader, it tells you the name of that thing. So for anything you can think of, going from what is a barber shop to, you know, the animals on a farm to all the planets, which weren't that many at the time, or anything you can think of. It's all in there. This was the first attempt to integrate words and pictures for kids in an educational book. And it became the most popular children's book in Europe for 100 years. So, and he writes in this about the power of graphics to help you understand things, that you have to have images as well as words to really understand. In terms of the science of instruction, I think we have to begin with a clear instructional objective, statement of the knowledge we want someone to acquire, and kind of the main business of cognitive science really is to describe mental representations. And these are the 5 main kinds of, qualitatively different kinds of mental representations that I think we're trying to build in an academic setting. Factual knowledge, conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, strategic knowledge, and this last one, which is the newer edition, beliefs and attitudes, thoughts about your own learning. Most of the work I'm going to present to you has to do with conceptual learning, but I do think these principles apply to the others as well. If we're interested in teaching for understanding, it's important to be able to evaluate learning. And the 2 classic ways of evaluating learning are a retention test, where we ask people to remember what's presented, and transfer tests, where we ask people to apply what they've learned to new situations. I'm most interested in transfer, but you have to recognize there has to be retention for transfer to happen. You have to be able to transfer something. It has to actually be there, and then you transfer it. So 3 kinds of learning outcomes based on these 2 measures are no learning. This occurs when people do poorly on both retention and transfer. Rote learning, when you do well on retention but not so well on transfer, a very common pattern. And meaningful learning, here I think the signature pattern is doing well on both retention and transfer. So I'm trying to go for this scenario. All the research I'm going to show you, though, is based on transfer tests. I'm looking at seeing if we can improve people's transfer performance. Just a couple other things about the science of instruction. In an instructional situation, learners can engage in extraneous processing. This is cognitive processing that is irrelevant to the instructional goal. So if you're daydreaming, or if you're, I don't know, not focused, or if I'm doing something really weird and you're watching my weirdness instead of listening, that's all extraneous. Essential processing, this is cognitive processing to mentally represent the content. And generative processing, this is cognitive processing that goes beyond that to make sense out of it, to relate it to prior knowledge, to reorganize it in a way that makes more sense to you. So we can have 3 main instructional problems. There can be so much extraneous processing that you don't have cognitive capacity for engaging in deep learning. Or if we get rid of the extraneous processing, if we design the instruction well, it still might be so complicated that it overloads working memory. So we need a way of managing essential processing. Or maybe you have the capacity but you don't use it. That's more of a motivational problem. So let me try and summarize kind of the 3 goals I have in instruction. One is to remove or reduce extraneous processing. So we want to design instruction so that it eliminates extraneous processing. We want to manage essential processing. So if we have something really complicated, we have to present it in a way that people can handle it. And we want to foster generative processing. We want to motivate people to want to go deeper into the material and try to make sense out of it. So all the instructional principles that I'm going to talk about fit under one of those 3 goals. Is that making sense? Okay. So I probably don't have to do this for this audience, but I want to take an evidence-based approach. This was William James's dream to instruction. So look at what does the evidence have to say about what's the best way to design instructional presentations. And the metric that this field uses is effect size. So we look at, do I have a slide that, no? We look at the, say the test performance of the control group and the experimental group, subtract those, so we see how much better does the experimental group do compared to the control group, and divide that by the pooled standard deviation. So effect size is telling you how many standard deviations better does one group do than the other because of the instructional feature I put in. Does that make sense? What I mean by effect size? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
I'm sorry. This is just referring back one slide.
Okay.
How do you reconcile the desire to reduce extraneous processing with some of the principles in, say, universal design, where you're trying to give people multiple pathways into a particular piece of content?
Yeah, I think too much learner control creates extraneous processing, and there's this research area is still emerging, obviously, but I think the consensus is that learner control, too much learner control for novices is not effective. So I'm not a big fan of giving people too much control. My kids wouldn't say that. I don't know. Okay, so I'll give you examples of some of the materials we've used so you can see. We're doing very just well-controlled lab type studies. I'm not even sure they apply to the real world, but I'm hoping some folks here will try to see if they do apply in more real context. This is the very first study I ever did on how bicycle tire pumps work. I thought at UC Santa Barbara this would be good because all the students have bicycles, but none of them actually knew how a pump works. This is kind of a text-based way of explaining it. This is slides from a narrated animation. And here's a retention test where we can ask people to write down what they remember. And as a transfer test, we could ask people, how could you make a pump more reliable or more effective? Or suppose you're using it and it doesn't work, what could have gone wrong? I just wanted to get some concrete examples. This is a little lesson on how lightning storms develop. This is from narrated animation that explains it. Basically, I found out we don't really know what causes lightning. It's kind of like human behavior. Afterwards, you can explain why somebody did what they did, but you can't predict it in advance. So retention test is to write down what you can remember. A transfer test is to answer questions like this. And this is from the break, so I think I'll just go on. Let me try to explain to you the rationale for focusing on multimedia learning. If you ask people to read a little passage about how bicycle tire pumps work, I actually took this from the World Book Encyclopedia back in the day when it actually was a paper-based encyclopedia. And the only part that really explains how it works are those last two sentences. They weren't in italics, I just did that. And what I find is if you ask people to read this and then you test them on the material, they remember about 25% of it, even if the test is immediate. Nice to know. And on a transfer test, they have no idea. They don't really understand how a pump works. If you add graphics to the text, so I just took the last two sentences, I incorporated them into a very simple graphic that has the pump when the handle's up and the pump when the handle's down, and I put the words next to the part of the graphic they're talking about, this vastly improves people's understanding of how a bicycle tire pump works. So without the graphics, they can't answer the transfer questions. But with the graphics and the exact same words, they do much, much better. The same thing for narration. We can kind of explain in voice how it works. That does not help transfer performance very much. But if we give them an animation along with the narration, that vastly improves people's ability to transfer what they've learned. This shows you the results of 9 studies. The black bars are are words and pictures as the presentation. The white bars are words alone, and the y-axis is the percent correct on a transfer test. You can see people are doing much better on a transfer test if they get words and pictures versus words alone. This is what it kind of gets me excited about the idea of multimedia learning. I think we can greatly increase people's understanding, at least in this case, of how things work by including graphics. Is that making sense? Okay. Oh gosh, I'm going too slow. Let me look at 5 principles for, here's the problem though. Not all graphics are equally helpful. If all we had to do was add any graphic to words, we'd be done. But kind of what I found out after this was, yeah, it's very easy to use graphics in an ineffective way. So the real question here is, how can we integrate words and pictures to maximize learning? So the first set of principles has to do with reducing extraneous processing. So let me start with the coherence principle, which is not, it's certainly not my idea. It's not original. This has been part of instructional design wisdom for a long time. And it's to keep things as simple as you can. So people learn more deeply when extraneous material is excluded rather than included. So in the 23 experimental comparisons we could find in the literature, this was confirmed in almost all of them, with a median effect size of 0.86. And the conventional wisdom, I think, is that any effect size greater than 0.4 is educationally important. 0.8 is considered large. So this is a large effect, median effect size. Let me give you an example of what I mean by the coherence principle. This comes from a multimedia, a PowerPoint, series of PowerPoint slides explaining how a virus causes a cold. So we're up to step 5 here, where breaking free from the host cell. You can see we're not in this for the artistic quality. We're in it for just the research. This is just a research prototype. But this explains the 6 steps in how this process works. It's very simplified. But what we added here is an interesting fact. These last 2 sentences that says, a study conducted by researchers at Wilkes University reveals that people who make love once or twice a week are more immune to colds than folks who abstain. And it goes on. We did a little pre-study listing 63 little facts about viruses, and UCSB rated that as the #1 most interesting fact. Who knew? It's interesting. All the interesting facts either involved sex, death, or filth. So if you really want to interest students, deal with sex, death, and filth. They were not interested in numbers or little factoids. Anyway, you might think inserting these are sometimes called seductive details, might make it more interesting, might make people pay more attention, but what you find is adding these depresses people's performance on a test that measures how well they understand the process of how a virus causes a cold. They remember that fact very well, but they don't understand the process we're trying to teach them. So this is just a summary, if you don't believe me, of the studies that we looked at. Most of them involve lightning. This was a very popular topic to use. Ocean waves, brake systems. On the right is the effect size, looking at the group that gets the lesson with or without extraneous material. Sometimes the extraneous material involved background music and sound. Sometimes it involved little video slices, let's say, of lightning storms so you could see what lightning storms look like, or little interesting facts about lightning, a little picture of a football player who lightning went through his helmet from one side to the other, and it's a picture of him holding his helmet with a big hole in it. Those all depress learning. So in all these studies with different kinds of content, we're getting a median effect size of 0.86. So one very basic design principle is to not include material that doesn't need to be there, that doesn't really support the instructional goal. Second principle, which is very similar, is the signaling principle. This is the idea that if you can't take out the extraneous material, at least highlight the important material. Seems weird. If you can highlight the important, why not just take out the extraneous? But anyway, we tried this because it has a long history in text design, and we wanted to expand it to multimedia design. And you can see in 24 out of 28 studies, we're getting a median effect size of 0.41. So it's just over the line here in terms of educational importance. Here's an example from a lesson on how an airplane achieves lift, which I think about every time I'm on the runway. It's just got to do with the shape of the wing. That's the only thing that's keeping us up. Seems very fragile. So to signal it, we added headings, and if we speak it, we just emphasize that in our voice. So wing shape, curved upper surface is longer, and then say the rest in a normal voice. So we used headings, and the key words were spoken in a stronger voice, more stressed voice. That's all I mean by signaling here. So that's the study by Matone and Mayer on airplane, it says. We get a fairly good effect size there. And you can see in a lot of the other studies that use various forms of signaling, it can improve performance. The cases where it's not as effective is in visual signaling, which is sometimes called cueing, where you try to have arrows pointing to things or something flashing, or put a spotlight on whatever it is you want people to look at. We don't know as much about how to do that effectively, and that's why I think some of the effect sizes are not very strong. It's the ones that are looking at cueing. Yeah.
So I imagine an engineer who really knows this, visualizes something, right?
Right.
And he can move into it.
Right. So most of these principles are for novices or beginners, or what I would call low prior knowledge learners. When you're dealing with high knowledge learners, there might be a different set of principles that are important. And when we find what I'm calling boundary conditions, one of the major boundary conditions are these principles tend to apply much better for low knowledge than high knowledge learners. So if you are dealing with engineers who already have a lot of background knowledge and can visualize on their own, adding visualizations might actually get in their way if they already have their way of doing it. So, I mean, that's an important point to make. But most of our students are beginners, at least at one point. So, and some of the research shows when you're dealing with more experienced learners, the instructional method doesn't matter as much. So I'm trying to focus on beginners, basically. So some of the other studies on the signaling effect, or signaling principle. Redundancy, this is the idea that if you have a narrated animation, like let's say the lightning passage that explains the 16 steps in lightning formation, where you see an animation and you hear a voice, you might be tempted to also add on-screen text, so captions that kind of say the same thing as the text, as the voice, because some people might prefer to read it. You might want to give people the option to read it if they don't want to listen. But what we find in our studies is adding redundant on-screen text to a narrated animation or video depresses performance. So in 16 out of 16 studies with a large effect size, it's better to have just voice and graphics than voice, graphics, and redundant on-screen text. Yeah.
Not just with average learners, because I am follow up on that question, thinking about people who have hearing issues or have auditory processing issues.
Of course. So I think that's a really good point. So there are boundary conditions for all of these. So these are not like laws in stone that you have to follow. It really depends on the human information processing system. You have to think about how are people processing the information. If people have hearing limitations, you obviously want printed text. But also, if the material has a lot of technical terms that are hard to hear, those should probably be on the screen. Or if it's long, if there's a lot of words, sometimes it's better to put it on the screen. Or if you have people who are not native speakers of English, it might be better to have the text. So there are a lot of situations where you want to have redundant text. One thing we found is that having short redundant text placed next to the part of the graphic it's talking about actually helps. So there might be a way to present the on-screen text in a way that helps. It's kind of just exploring that, but that's a really good point. So these are the kind of the studies that have demonstrated this effect. You can see they're pretty consistent, but they're limited in their content, I guess. Spatial contiguity. Well, this is the idea that if you're going to have, so I just said it's not good to have printed words on the screen, but if you're going to have printed words on the screen or page, so let's say we're laying out a textbook, we can't have narration, we have to have printed text. It's better to have the words next to the part of the graphic that they are referring to. Instead of having a caption at the bottom or text in a paragraph separate from the graphic, it's better to have the text actually in the graphic itself. So in 22 out of 22 experimental tests, we're getting an effect size greater than 1, which is a huge effect in education. Let me give you an example. This is from a lesson on how a car's braking system works. On the top, the driver has not yet pressed on the pedal. On the bottom, the driver has pressed on the pedal. And then we can have words that explain it. When the driver steps on the car's brake pedal, a piston moves forward in the master cylinder, and so on. That's what I call separated presentation, because the words and the graphics are physically separated. This is a more integrated presentation. It has the exact same words, the exact same graphics, but the graphics are, the words are somewhat closer to the part of the graphic they're talking about. So when the driver steps on the car's brake pedal, that's by the brake pedal. The piston moves forward in the master cylinder, that's by the master cylinder, and so on. Each action is placed next to the part of the graphic it's talking about. Does that make sense? What I mean by integrated? Same thing for the lightning passage. We could put the text at the bottom where it says, as the air in the updraft cools, water vapor condenses into water droplets and forms a cloud. Or we could put that next to the actual updraft. So by moving it up and putting it next to the updraft, that's an integrated presentation. You can see in all the studies that we've looked at, an integrated presentation is more effective on a transfer test than a separated presentation. I like these studies because students are getting the exact same graphics and the exact same words. It's just where on the page you put the words. Just moving them next to the part of the graphic they're talking about has a huge effect on their understanding, as evidenced by transfer performance, giving us an overall effect size of greater than 1. Temporal contiguity, this is kind of the same thing when we're talking about, let's say, a narrated animation or a narrated video. You might think it would be better to maybe present the narration first and then the animation, or vice versa, giving people 2 exposures to the same material. You might double the amount of exposure people get, but you can see in 9 out of 9 tests, it's better to present the corresponding words and graphics at the same time, simultaneously, rather than successively. In fact, even having the soundtrack off by 5 or 10 seconds from the video or animation destroys people's understanding. It's extremely frustrating. Not that I enjoy watching people getting frustrated, but I did smile, didn't I? Sorry. So you can see in these studies, we're getting a median effect size greater than 1. So these are all techniques for reducing extraneous processing. Get rid of the extraneous material, so the seductive words or the seductive illustrations or background sounds. Highlight the essential material by voice or by bolding or underlining. Don't add text if there already is narration. Place the words next to the part of the graphic they're talking about, and make sure that the verbal material and the visual material are presented at the same time. Corresponding words and pictures are presented at the same time, because we want people in working memory to connect them, and if they're not presented at the same time, it's harder to make that connection. Did those all make sense?
So isn't this just simply good graphic design?
Yes.
Advertisers have done this for decades.
Uh,
Coffee does this. I mean,
yeah.
Apple does this.
Well,
iOS. So
I think there are aspects of Tufte that are consistent with this and some that aren't. I love his talk about, what does he call that? Chart junk. That's the coherence principle. And I agree with you. These same principles are used in advertising and in persuasive messages. So people like who are interested in persuasive messages, you know, I find it so interesting. They have a lot of the same principles, which shows me they're very smart. They thought of my principles. Wait, how's that possible? Although there's some nuances. I went to a conference recently where they pointed out that things really have to be reduced for men, not so much for women. So when you have ads, and they showed ads for men and women, there's hardly any words in the ones for men. But I don't know what that means. I shouldn't go there. Never mind. So, but I agree with the thrust of your question. So manage essential processing. So up until maybe 5 or 10 years ago, almost all the research was on trying to eliminate extraneous processing. Then we realized, hey, if we do that, people still are having trouble learning. If we have really complicated material and the learner's not familiar with it, that can easily overload their working memory. So what do we do in that situation? 3 things we can do are present the material in parts. So break it down, present one segment at a time. Or we can give some sort of pre-training. They need to know what all the words mean before we try to put them all together into a system. So like in that photosynthesis slide, they need to know what all those terms are before we try to show them all that stuff. So that's what I mean by pre-training, knowing the names and the characteristics of the main concepts. And the modality principle, this involves using spoken words rather than printed words. So the segmenting principle, people learn more deeply when a narrated animation is presented in learner-paced segments rather than as a continuous unit. In 10 out of 10 tests, we're getting a large effect size. So for example, in the lightning passage, it has 16 main events occurring in it. After each one, we can stop the animation and have this little continue button. You have to click on it to go on. So it says cool moist air moves over a warmer surface and becomes heated. And then to go on, you have to click. Just giving people that tiny amount of control over the pacing of the presentation has a huge effect on their transfer test performance. They do much better on tests that involve being able to use the material to answer transfer questions. So that's seems like a very small thing to do for a very large effect. And you can see in some of these other studies about lightning, electric motors, teaching skills, various other topics, they break things down in different ways, but taking a long, complicated lesson and breaking it into manageable parts that you have to master before you go on to the next part can have a huge effect on understanding. Pre-training principle, it's kind of similar really to segmenting. You might even say it's just a special case. People learn more deeply from a narrated animation when they have had training in the names and characteristics of the key concepts. So in 13 out of the 16 tests that we could find in the literature, we get a median effect size of 0.75, so almost a strong effect. Let me give you an example from the break lesson. Here, before we tell you about how brakes work, we have a little narrated animation about brakes. We show you this little map of the braking system with all the parts like the piston, the brake shoe, the brake drum. You can click on any part and then you get a little spotlight. So you click on the, let's say, the master cylinder, you get a little spotlight that says, this is the piston in the master cylinder, it can move forward and back. So you know the name of it and you know its characteristics. So you go through and learn about each part separately. Once you know what each part is, so we found many of our students didn't know what a piston was, didn't know what a lot of these things were. So now they know that, now they have some idea of what these words mean. Now when we give them the full narrated animation, they can understand it better, they do better on a transfer test. So you can see when we give some form of pre-training on these various content areas, in most of the cases it results in an improvement on transfer performance. giving us a large effect size. Does that make sense? The modality principle, this is the idea that people learn better from words that are spoken rather than printed if we have graphics. So if we're going to have graphics and words, it's better for the words to be spoken. This is the most studied principle, and it may be a little contentious also. But in the overwhelming majority of studies, this is upheld with a large effect size. Let me give you an example. So from the lightning passage, let's say, we can either present the explanation as a narration or as captions. So as you're viewing it, you're also seeing the caption. The problem with having a caption is it creates what people call a split attention problem. Because if your eyes are looking at the words, they can't be looking at the animation. If they're looking at the animation, they can't be looking at the words. Since this is a fast-paced presentation, if you miss something, you can't go back to it. So if you're reading along and something happens in the animation and you don't see it, you miss that. So we're kind of overloading the visual channel with having both to read and to process the graphic. If we offload the words onto the ear, onto the verbal channel, then you can use your eyes for the graphics, you can use your ears for the words. That effectively increases your processing capacity. Does that make sense? Okay. But, like we said, there are boundary conditions. There are places when it's good to have printed words, some of the things we already talked about. For example, the modality principle only works for a fast-paced lesson when the material's complex, and there are a few other issues, but those are the two main ones. So you can see, I separated these into foundational studies. So all the early studies find strong effects. So these first ones all conducted in Australia. So who knows about that? I mean, no, only kidding. Then some conducted in our lab. Those have to be right. Then a few others here. So this whole first set of studies up until 10 years ago all got pretty strong results. Then once you have a strong effect like this, people want to show you're wrong. So they figure out all kinds of ways to show it doesn't happen. So these I'm calling studies testing the boundary conditions. So in this case, we're getting more studies with negative effects or non-effects, like this first one by Tabers et al. This is a very slow-paced lesson. So it doesn't really matter that much whether you have printed words or spoken words. And in a way, printed words are better because they're not transient. They're permanently there. So if you have all the time you need, and you can look back and forth, then you're not going to get this effect. For some of the other studies, they're using material that's very simple. When it's simple, you also don't have to worry about this. So these are studies that kind of are setting up the boundary conditions, but overall we're getting a median effect size of 0.76. So these three principles are for managing essential processing, break a complicated lesson down into parts, make sure learners know the names and characteristics of each of the key concepts, and use spoken text if you can. I know I'm kind of a little bit over my time here, so let me just try to go fast through this last one. Am I okay? Yeah. Fostering generative processing. So here we want to get, if students have the capacity but don't use it, it means they're not motivated, they're not trying to make sense out of the material. So how do you get people to want to make sense out of the material? The two principles I'm going to look at are the personalization principle and voice principle. In the personalization principle, I'm kind of really queasy about this because this is getting into social psychology and I'm more of a cognitive psychologist, so I'm getting nervous. But this is the idea that people learn more deeply from a conversational style than a formal style. So using things like first and second person instead of third person, that puts things in conversational style. When we first started doing this, I thought this will never work. But you can see in 14 out of 17 tests, we're getting a large effect size by doing something as simple as just changing the wording. So for example, here's a text from a lesson on how the human respiratory system works. During inhaling, the diaphragm moves down, creating more space for the lungs. Air enters through the nose or mouth. Actually, we found 2 textbooks in California that had this reverse, that said the diaphragm moves down. No, that says you breathe in, that causes your diaphragm to move down. So, kind of explains our test scores. But, okay. Anyway, so you can see that's third person. To personalize it, we just changed the to your. So, during inhaling, your diaphragm moves down, creating more space for your lungs, and so on. So, a very, very simple change. We just substituted your for the in about 13 places in this lesson. That has a huge effect. This is the Mayer Fennell et al. Lungs study. We're getting very large effects. Also, doing the same thing using polite wording when you have an on-screen agent who's interacting with the learner, having that agent use polite wording like saying, instead of saying, press the enter key, he could say, why don't we press the enter key? That improves learning. It's more of a conversational friendly style. So that's one version of personalization. And the voice principle, the idea is people learn more deeply from a human voice. I got really in trouble from a journal for calling it standard accented. That's kind of suggesting there's some kind of standard accent. But so a human voice rather than a machine voice. And I know we have great synthesizers that can speak, but you still can tell it's a computer. So to the extent that you can tell it's a machine, it kind of violates the illusion that you have a social relationship. Having a human voice greatly enhances learning. In 5 out of 6 studies, we're getting a large effect size. So personalization and voice. This is a summary of all the principles that I talked to you about, 10 principles. We have more, but I figured 10 is a good amount, and there they are. So my bottom line really here is that people learn better from multimedia messages when they're designed in ways that are consistent with how the human mind works and are consistent with research-based principles. And if you're interested in reading more, I would suggest these fantastic books, or feel free to email me. And thank you very much.
I can make some inferences about your thoughts about flipped classrooms, but can you spare me that inferring and talk about flipped classrooms?
So you're talking about the situation where you maybe view the lecture before class and use class for going into more depth. I think it has a lot of potential. I mean, there's actually some research evidence that shows it can be effective. So I really think that's an area that we need more research on to kind of perfect exactly how to set up a flipped classroom in an effective way. Right now it's kind of a class of instructional methods. Different people implement it in different ways, and I think some of them are probably effective and some might not be. So we definitely need research on how to do this in an effective way. I tell my class, I'm doing a flipped classroom. Read my book before class, and then in class we'll discuss it, but it's not effective, I think. I found out one way it's not effective. So do you use flipped classroom?
I don't, but a lot of the people I work with are interested in it.
Uh-huh. So
Are there specific mistakes that are likeliest in a flipped classroom situation?
I'm not that familiar with the features that make it effective and not yet. I don't think we really have the research literature yet to definitively say that. But there are some good published papers that show it's effective, so I think it has potential.
I was wondering if there's any data or theoretical sort of predictions on the effect on learning of words alone versus graphics or animations alone. Is there any one better than the other in any situations?
Well, this is a classic issue in the psychology of learning, starting with word lists. Like you can have a list of printed words or a list of pictures of those words, which are better. And it kind of depends on the concreteness of the words, and also depends on how you depict the images. But, you know, it's probably, usually pictures alone are not enough to help people learn. I mean, the thing I'm basing this on is when you give people words and pictures and kind of watch what they do in an eye tracker, they read the words and then they look at the part of the graphic the words are talking about. Then they go back and read more words and look at the part of the graphic it's talking about. So they're using the words to guide how they process the graphic. And I think we are, you know, in our culture, we're just so word-based that we're using the words to make sense out of the graphics. It probably depends to some extent on just how understandable the graphic is on its own. If you could generate the words on your own by looking at the graphic, you've kind of created your own multimedia, so it's probably fine. Right, exactly. That's a really interesting world where, yeah, those instructions are much better than words, because they, yeah, that's true. True.
So if you give the learner a choice, say, between turning on a narration versus captions and transcript, or both, along with an animation, will the learner make a wise choice?
Probably not. I mean, I think what we find from novice, you know, from low experience learners is they generally don't have the metacognitive knowledge to make good choices. So they usually don't choose what, you know, an instructional designer would have chosen when you give them the choice. I would think they'd probably turn on both because it just seems like fun. When we know from this research that's not a good idea. They also have a hard time knowing how much they learned. They might think the lesson's really good and really like it and yet not do very well from it. So they're not good at judging how well they're learning, and they're not that good at determining what features they should put in it. So I'm kind of more on the side of more guidance for beginning learners. I think when you have more experienced learners, they should have more freedom. The discovery learning is good for, I think, more experienced learners. You don't want to constrain them too much. But for beginners, a more constrained environment would maybe help them focus on the content.
Most of the material you showed was in STEM settings, with the exception of Chinese text.
Yes.
And for relatively novice learners, but you made the comment that this generalizes more broadly. One of the concepts that's there in psychology is flow, where you try to keep cognitive kind of effort below anxiety and above boredom. There's a similar one in education of cognitive, constructive struggle. What evidence, or what have you looked at in disciplines outside of this? How do you know that it generalizes, or is that just intuition?
I don't even know if it generalizes to classrooms. That's why I like talking to this audience. I'm hoping somebody will be interested in trying to see how well this actually applies in the real world over a long term. Because we don't, I mean, these might work in the short term, but not be that important in the long term, or I don't know. We've done a few classroom studies that have been encouraging, that have given us good results, but I think we really need more. And disciplines beyond STEM, I think that's a great, that's an important issue. There have been some studies in the literature that have found that these principles apply in some non-STEM areas. I think a couple in history, but there hasn't been a ton of work. And I think maybe they have to be adapted in some way to fit each discipline. I think the graphics, there's a kind of graphic style for each discipline. I really haven't gone into that, but even in kind of math versus in physics versus in chemistry, they have different kinds of graphics. So yeah, it's good to have graphics, but I think there's a style in each discipline.
I think you might have started to answer my question there, but I'm just wondering if your research has extended to the learning outcomes of multimedia learning in blended learning models versus just in distance learning models.
Mm-hmm. Now, I haven't really looked at that issue, but I think that's a really important, practical issue, and it's important from a theoretical point of view too. So, no, I think that's a place we need to know more. We know a lot about things that are easy, and we don't know a lot about things that are hard. That's kind of the way it works.
Richard, thank you for coming. So I work helping to build these open online courses, and I was wondering if you've had a chance to look at some, and if you think there are lessons that we should be integrating into the kinds of things that we're doing, particularly with video presentation. And it seems difficult to think about how to combine text and visuals consistently, and not revert to sort of just lecture style, which is something we're all grappling with.
So when you're talking about video, you're talking about recorded lectures, or is that?
Yeah, any kind of video presentation of the teaching. Usually it's the faculty member explaining something,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe based on your research, there's better ways to get teaching.
Yeah. Well, we should talk about specifically what you're looking at, but I'm sure there are probably ways to design video presentations that are going to be more effective. We've been trying in the last couple of years to look specifically at second language, learning in your second language when you have video, because there are a lot of students at American universities from other countries who are not native speakers. What can you do to enhance learning? And also in a lot of universities around the world, courses are being taught in English when that's really not the national language. So so it'd be interesting to look at something like a lecture. How can you take a video lecture and help people make more sense out of it, especially if you're learning in a second language? You might think adding captions might be good, or we haven't found that. But I'd be glad to talk to you more in detail about the specifics you're interested in.
So I have a question about your segmenting rule.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm understanding things correctly, you're really applying that to very discrete learning objectives, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
In terms of transfer. And since so often, of course, learning is a process in which you build sort of one's learning, one might argue that the segment rule might run the risk of flying in the face of higher order learning,
Mm-hmm.
synthesis and coherence.
Mm-hmm.
So have you worked out with your studies a way in which you, if you will, begin simple and then build sort of sequentially, and does the graphical element sort of evolve over time,
Mm-hmm.
to really allow for synthesis?
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic issue. You're absolutely right. This issue has played out in I think most strongly in skill learning literature that goes back, generations. It's like, if you're learning a skill, like let's say how to swim, is it better to practice your hand strokes and kicking and breathing separately or all together? Well, if you're going to have to use them all together, it's better to practice them all together, probably. So that would be a situation where part whole practice maybe not be the way to do it. You might want to do a whole part. And there might be some educational, conceptual learning that's like that, where if it's a performance skill and all the parts have to be integrated, yeah, I can see that's a problem. But in all the things that we've studied so far, there's been a way to break them into parts that are each one understandable and still can be added together later. But I understand the point of your question. That's a hard one. I mean, learning, you're right, is always, it's not like you've learned this and it's over. Then there's a deeper way of actually understanding it. So I'm just thinking, for an intro level course, you want kind of an intro level of understanding. But then as you get more advanced, you need maybe a whole different way of looking at it. You have a question?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was interested in the modality principle that you mentioned about how it is more effective to use spoken rather than written printed text accompanied by graphics. Do you find any differences now with the iGeneration learners that are dealing mostly with texting, social networking profiles, social networking communities, email, that they're sort of bombarded with the written word and maybe have less
spoken,
less spoken word in their lives? Are you noticing sort of an evolution in the data and the results that you're seeing?
I focus mainly on, 18-year-olds, so they're probably they're probably into it. So I haven't noticed a change over the years that we've been doing the research. Our target audience is freshmen, probably. So.
Thanks.
Can you comment a little bit over the years? People have changed their instructional because of computers, PowerPoint. Years ago, when people went to college, the guy went to the blackboard, and that seems kind of primitive. Now we flash things at PowerPoint, but you have something like Khan Academy, which seems quite successful. He's very simple. He doesn't use PowerPoint, just draws on the blackboard.
Yeah.
And so I just want to hear a little bit of your thoughts about that, because I'm a little bit more Khan Academy, very simple diagrams rather than the kind of things I've been using. And so I just want to hear some thoughts here.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've thought a lot about that. Just personally, for my own teaching. When I ask my students, would you rather have a PowerPoint presentation or a talk and chalk, they're about 50-50. I find this interesting. I thought they'd all want PowerPoint, but some of them don't. The classic answer is that media don't cause learning. It's the instructional method that causes learning. So it's possible to have a PowerPoint lecture that's effective or not effective, and it's possible to have a talk and chalk lecture that's effective or not effective. But I do think PowerPoint is constraining in a lot of ways because it forces you to put all the material on the screen at once, and then people have to process it. Whereas if you're on a board, you can be drawing it as you're talking about it, and it creates more of a feeling, I think, maybe that you're working with the students, they're working with you, we're working together to understand this. And a PowerPoint presentation can, just the way all the defaults are set up, they encourage you to engage in some poor design activities, I think. So I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint myself, but like I said, it's not the medium that is causing the learning. What are your thoughts on it?
I guess I use PowerPoint, but I think it's actually bad.
Yeah, I think there's a problem with overloading. We're doing a study now where we're comparing, kind of doing the study that you're talking about, where you watch a video of an instructor presenting the material and drawing it on the board versus that same instructor with a PowerPoint presentation and comparing, and the PowerPoint presentation is actually the final version of what they drew on the board. And we're finding that people are learning better from watching somebody draw it than seeing the complete graphic there as a final product. So there might be something, there's this whole field of embodied cognition that tries to explain things like this, but there might be something to actually seeing somebody draw it that is helpful. Khan Academy, it might be a little too fast. That's my only problem with Khan Academy. And it has some extraneous, just some cute little extraneous things. So if I were a consultant, I would clean some of those up a little bit. But I think that's an interesting technique, and it would be interesting to see. No one's really tested very well how Khan Academy works. I mean, we all think it's great, and a lot of people use it, but we need some research on whether it really is.
Another question is, you haven't mentioned teaching of mathematics at all. And I'm just wondering about that, because there's different methods of teaching equations and diagrams and very rich graphics in functions like analytic geometry and things like that. I'm just wondering if there's any research in this area, because it seems to me that the graphics, the algebra and the geometry together, or some kind of diagrams, has that been researched at all? Because that's something I think is quite important, and somehow you haven't mentioned that.
Yeah. There hasn't been as much research as you might want. I mean, I think you're right. Math is used a lot of, starting with concrete manipulatives in the primary grades, which is a form of, it's a very concrete form of representation, up to using graphics. That's been a theme in mathematics education for a long time, that you need to be able to coordinate multiple forms of representation. That's what we want in mathematics learning. You have to be able to understand, be able to say it in words, in equations, and in graphics, see the connections between them. So it's a theme in the literature, but the actual research that's kind of multimedia, I haven't seen a lot of it yet.
All right, 2 more questions. Thank you for a very stimulating talk. I find your principles to be very insightful and potentially very helpful to me as an instructor. One of the challenges that I'm thinking about now is how to take these principles and apply them in the real sort of world context in which we face trade-offs in terms of time that we have the students' attention and so on. And I'm wondering if, to perhaps shed light on this question, you can tell us a little bit about the process that you used here today in deciding how you would approach the learning experience of everyone here in this classroom. You clearly had a lot of material that you wanted us to be familiar with. And if you could illustrate a little bit how you had to trade off your design principles with the realities of having to do this in an hour and 20 minutes.
That's a good question. That's a really good question. Well, I'm not that happy with my presentation, but I was thinking, what do I want people to get out of this? So I wanted a little bit about what is the science of learning? What are these things that people in this field have come up with over the last 100 years? So I tried to just hit the highlights there. And then the same thing for the science of instruction. I just wanted to hit this idea of extraneous processing, generative processing, essential processing. But I wanted to spend most of the time on what are the principles, where did they come from, what's the evidence for them. So I wanted to have examples, but I don't really have time to actually run the programs or show you too much. So I kind of feel that it would have been better to have more examples, but I'm hoping it came through. I don't know.
On the last question, you guys can hear me, yes? So again, thank you for this. So it sounds like the learners in most of these studies were around 18.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking about brain development, and I'm wondering how the principles might need to change depending on the age of the learner, thinking both children and also adults, because 18, they're still sort of, their brains are still growing.
Yeah, there's something. Yeah. Well, we have done some. We've done some studies with kids and some studies with older people, more training studies for more at the level of military personnel. But I haven't found huge differences. In fact, sometimes we take the exact same study that we did in middle school and use it with college students at UCSB, and it works just the same. I feel like I'm insulting the older students, but they just accepted it. It seems fine. So maybe from junior high to high school or college, maybe it's not that big of a difference. Certainly, elementary school it is. But I haven't found huge differences. I mean, the one study, for example, that we did in the primary grades, I guess with 5th graders, looked at teaching math using a mental number line with a little bunny that jumped on it. So that greatly helped them understand it. So I know visualizations, and there's other research that shows, like you were saying, visualizations in math can help. And
also you did some research with adults, you said?
Not with them teaching them arithmetic, but a lot of research with adults. That study with adults and with middle school kids was on environmental science.
All right, thank you everyone. We'll put the slides, we'll put the video on Hilt's website, and please join me in thanking Rich.
Thank you.